Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be talking about the up-and-coming energy crisis that will hit Europe this winter as Europe will feel the effects of Russia turning off the gas supplies to Europe, and we'll be asking, is Europe ready to face such an energy crisis? So in joining me in today's programme, I'm joined by Robin Benson, who's a Christian commentator, together with David Curtin, who's the leader of the Heritage Party. David, I'll start off with you first. Great to have you both on the programme. Just give us a bit of an update. We know that this is summer recess time for all the major political parties. You know, Parliament is no longer in recess. There's holiday breaks on. But share with us a little bit about the Heritage Party and how our viewers can get involved and support your parties. You stand on kind of biblical principles, which is very, very rare, especially when we look at the Conservative leadership contest right now.
Yeah, well, it's a funny summer this summer because normally, as you say, Parliament's in recess and nothing is going on in politics. But at the moment, we've got the whole Conservative Party leadership contest, which I think people are just looking at the two candidates and saying, well, you know, they're both as bad as each other. But I set the Heritage Party up nearly a couple of years ago now to be a real alternative, to actually have proper Conservative policies, nothing to do with the Conservative Party, but real common sense policies that advocate for freedom, traditional family values, financial responsibility, controlling our borders and this kind of thing. So anyone can get involved and become a member. You can join us on heritageparty.org. We want to stand more candidates in the local elections coming up in May and when the general election comes up as well, so that everybody has a chance to vote for something that has good principles that I think will get the country back on its feet again.
Absolutely, excellent. And good to see you, Robin, as well on this programme. What do you make of this crisis potentially affecting Europe? Well, we know it won't potentially, but will really affect Europe come the winter, because currently we're seeing that President Putin has turned off 20% of the gas supplies to Germany, which is the most dependent upon Russian gas. We've also seen that Putin has turned off the gas supplies to Denmark, the Netherlands, Latvia, Poland, Bulgaria and Finland, because they refuse to pay their gas in rubles, which is one of the conditions of the EU sanctions against Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine. What are your thoughts on this devastating energy crisis that we can expect to see come the winter?
Well, it's something that's been building since before Russia invaded the Ukraine, because Germany was already, I think, you know, reading into some of the material, Germany already sensed that this is what Putin was eventually going to do, and started to, you know, complain, talk about putting sanctions on Russia and so on, even at that point. So we're talking pre-February 24th. This has been building momentum since then. Putin is just, I mean, he's using gas as a means of leverage to try and fulfill his aims in taking out the Ukraine. And the EU, particularly Germany, but other EU nations have become so dependent on Russian gas over the last few years. And I don't think anybody ever imagined the scenario that we're now living in. And therefore the potential ripple effects and the consequences of what, as you point out, I mean, it's, you know, it's hot, it's warm outside, it has been, you know, for 2 or 3 weeks. We're talking about a drought now. We go from one extreme to another with this British weather. So we're, you know, everybody's comfortable. In fact, probably a lot of people are uncomfortable and trying to keep cool. But come October, end October, beginning of November, when the weather probably usually changes, things are going to be very different. You know, when we read the reports that there are in the media and the press at the moment about what, you know, major German cities, Austrian cities, other European cities are already implementing as far as their gas usage is concerned, and other knock-on effects, trying to get coal-powered power stations back up again, extending the length of nuclear power stations in some of the countries. This is going to have a tumultuous effect across Western Europe up into Scandinavia. right through the winter months.
Absolutely. And David, how much of this crisis, energy crisis affecting Europe is down to two issues? The one is the Germany and Europe's dependence upon Russian gas, number one, and then these other climate change policies and relying on renewable energy that don't produce enough electricity for the nation, and getting rid of fossil fuels and not investing in kind of nuclear power plants.
Yeah, I mean, those are two very important issues. The thing about this is it was completely and utterly avoidable. All of this was. I mean, first of all, European countries have been pursuing this net zero climate alarmist agenda for over a decade with Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. Germany in particular has pursued a policy of what they call the Energiewende, the energy change. And that was particularly after the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan after the tsunami. They decided they were going to close all their nuclear power stations and try to build a green infrastructure consisting of wind turbines and solar panels. But that doesn't provide enough energy for the country when the sun doesn't shine and the wind stops blowing. Anyone could see that from back in the day, but they still insisted on pursuing that anyway. So then to make up the gap, they have to buy gas from Russia. And of course, this situation's blown up this year. Again, I think that was totally avoidable because people could have done some negotiations with Russia beforehand, kept to the Minsk agreements from 2015 and so on. And then this situation this year wouldn't have happened either. But it's happened. It's not going to change. We are where we are. And so Germany in particular is in a big, big mess. And most of the other countries in Europe as well are going to be in the same mess that Germany's in.
Absolutely. And Robin, if we look at the consequences of this, really, I mean, it mostly affects Germany, but there are other European nations that are affected. But if we take Germany, for example, I mean, 50% of their energy in German homes are fueled by gas boilers. And with a massive reduction in gas supplies, this is going to affect the heating of people's homes. You talked about earlier how, for example, in Berlin, they're turning off the streetlights, and in Hamburg, they're also turning off the lights on monuments and what have you, and even possibly turning off the hot water supplies in Hamburg. Now they're talking about possibly cancelling Oktoberfest in October, the big beer festival in Germany, with the Christmas markets as well, and even closing down probably beer production from the breweries. I mean, if that doesn't cause a revolution in Germany,
that would cause a revolution in Germany. I mean, yeah.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the crisis facing Europe is unbelievably stark. As it is, almost like the lights are going to be switched off come the winter. And isn't it important that European nations also, that Britain is aware of this coming crisis, because we're in the midst of it. There's not a lot we can do about it.
Well, I think by this stage, because it has been building since early February, European nations are only too well aware of the potential crisis that's facing, particularly if the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine rumbles on, which it looks like it's going to do, for some considerable time. So, behind the headlines, pardon the pun.
Wrong programme.
Behind the headlines, I would think, I don't know what David thinks about this, but I think probably there are frantic negotiations going on behind the headlines to try and circumvent the Russian threat that's already being implemented. One of the problems is that there was coming this other gas pipeline, which the Americans kiboshed. They pulled out support for it, I think partly maybe from pressure from Turkey at the time. And so something that could have been a means of easing the situation was removed out of the equation at a point where then we have this domino effect of what we're seeing now. And it's going to be catastrophic if it continues. Because as you point out, so many homes in Germany depend on gas boilers. The effect that this is going to have on the elderly, those who have some sort of health issue, all of these people who are dependent on this source of heating or in producing electricity that produces heating in their homes, are really in for a tough time. And that includes us. we're not going to be immune from this either, because this part of that pipeline comes across to the UK too. We may not be as badly affected, but there will be the ripple effect here as well.
Absolutely. David, the big question really is saying how that cozying up to dictators, there's a price to pay. If you make a deal with the devil, then you pay the price. And this is what Germany's doing now. I mean, we saw that, for example, President Trump suspended the German-Russian deal, I think it was called the pipeline, and actually said they couldn't go ahead and build the Nord 1 pipeline between Russia and Germany as it cut off the Ukraine. And now we're seeing that Germany has built up its whole entire economy based on cheap Russian gas. And now that Russia is deciding to use the gas as a weapon, as a payback for European leaders' support for Ukraine in his invasion of the Ukraine, means that we're living in a kind of a precarious time. So again, is this a kind of failure of Western leaders to actually act responsibly and understand the kind of dangers posed by Russia, but also the science behind this new renewable technology is not adequate enough to produce enough heating and electricity that we need in order to have sustainability?
I think I'd look at it in a slightly different way to some of the things you put in your question. I mean, I think the whole situation in Ukraine it's been building up for 8 years. It hasn't started just out of the blue in February, as most of the Western mainstream media would make out, that Putin is the devil and suddenly he's decided to invade Ukraine for no reason whatsoever. This has been building up for 8 years because there were real neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine, such as the Azov Battalion, who have been shelling and bombing ethnic Russians in the Donbass area. And they were ready to go in and invade in February, and I think Putin has said, well, we're not going to let that happen. He calls it a special operation, and so he's gone in to try to protect the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Now, I know not everyone might agree with me. It depends if you get all your news from the Western mainstream media or you look at independent journalists who are on the ground in eastern Ukraine. You get some different views there of what you don't see on the Western mainstream. So I wouldn't sort of characterize, Russia as evil, as so on. But the situation's blown up because the West and Ukraine and the Zelensky regime there have not stuck to the Minsk agreements, which were put in place in 2014. You can look them up. So this was a completely avoidable conflict, but it's happened. And so because of that, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was about to be ready, the Germans have said, no, we're not doing that. And then there was most Western leaders decided, well, we're going to try to put crippling economic sanctions on Russia, so as some kind of collective punishment that the Russian people would then rise up and overthrow Putin, and then the war would be over. That was the thinking behind it. Liz Truss, our own foreign secretary, perhaps soon to be Prime Minister, said she wanted to cripple the Russian economy, which I think is a very irresponsible thing to say. And the European Union has been saying similar things. So with the sanctions that Western nations have put on Russia, Russia's bank accounts in the West have been frozen. So German companies, Finnish companies, Danish companies, Latvian companies cannot sort of pay for Russia, pay Russia for gas in euros or dollars, because if they do, it'll be into a frozen bank account that Russia can't access. So they said, well, if you want gas, you're going to have to pay into a ruble account in Moscow. And then the EU says, well, we can't do that. So then, well, Russia says, well, we can't give you gas because you're not willing to pay for it. So that's the situation. And it's all a big mess because, one person escalates, another person escalates, and the next person escalates, and it all gets out of control. What we need to do is just step back, sit around the table, work out how we can end the conflict, but not least because the longer this goes on, the more Ukrainians are going to die in Ukraine as well.
Absolutely. I agree with most of what you said, but I don't agree with you what Putin, because what Putin has effectively done is to invade another nation. The devastation, destruction he's caused in Ukraine amongst the Ukrainian people was unforgivable. The suppression of his own people as well, closing down any kind of free speech in Russia as well, quite frightening, and cozying up to some of the world's most dangerous dictators in the Middle East as well. It is a very worrying trajectory that he's heading in. Robin, I just want to kind of bring you onto this one. I mean, the prospect of Europe before no longer being self-sufficient in its energy supplies is quite frightening. I mean, I suppose the nearest example we've got to anything happening like this before is got to be after the aftermath of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, with the OPEC oil embargo on the EU, or the European Economic Commission as it was then, for their lack of support against the Arabs in their invasion of Israel in 73. Are we going to see something very, very similar across Europe? Because if there's not enough gas coming through to provide enough energy, and if, for example, people won't be able to drive their new electric cars, and this is a major problem, aren't we going to face real civil unrest across Europe?
Possibly. I mean, that may be an eventual outcome if it really gets to an extreme situation. But frankly, I don't think European governments will let it get that far. They don't want that. I think the way things are going, Ukraine is going to be left to hang out and dry. I think little by little, some of the European nations, as this begins to bite, are going to say, we're not going to pay the cost. And Ukraine, they're going to withdraw very slowly but very gradually their support for what's going on in Ukraine, just out of self-preservation, if nothing else. And you know, that there are rights and wrongs to that. I mean, each nation-state government is responsible for the protection and the security of its own people. I know you've got the European Union as a overarching monstrosity, you know, but nevertheless, each of the nation-states within Europe still will want to try and protect its own people. And if that means Ukraine paying a bad price for that, as literally the taps on the gas are closed, I think that's what will happen.
And it's interesting to seeing how European nations are responding to this, David. For example, Macron is wanting now to nationalize. He's certainly floating the idea of nationalizing the main electricity company in France, known as EDF, make that a national company. Other European nations are trying to stockpile as much gas as they can. Doesn't this kind of require a kind of rethink, particularly as Germany now is going back to kind of fossil fuel energy power plants? They're going back to the prospect of reopening decommissioned nuclear power stations. This whole green agenda is clearly not working in terms of providing renewable energy. It doesn't work, and it's not working.
Yeah, quite. I mean, if Europe as a whole wants to wean itself off Russian gas and be self-sufficient in energy, then the whole green energy infrastructure that they're building isn't going to work. That's quite clear. So, yeah, it's very interesting. Germany has been trying to close all their nuclear power stations. They've got 3 left. They might leave them open, but they don't really want to leave them open for a long time. They're just saying, oh, another 6 months while we find a new source of energy. But this is really pie in the sky. I mean, without Russian gas at the moment, it's going to take them years to find a new source of energy that is going to provide as much energy as they get through Nord Stream 1 and the other pipelines that come from Russia. You can't just build an energy infrastructure in a few months. It takes years and years. It'll take a decade. So I think what's going to happen is that there will be much more demand for Norwegian gas and also British gas, because those gas fields in the North Sea are connected in to the whole European gas pipeline infrastructure. As there's not so much gas coming from Norway and Britain as there is from Russia, the price of gas is going to go through the roof, of course. Russia's already cut supplies by 80% through Nord Stream 1. As you said, it's only 20% of the gas is coming through. And it's summer, and they're already struggling, and it's August, you know. So what's it going to be like in December? It's going to be very, very tough. They're not going to be able to find an extra supply to even make up for it. I mean, they're talking about bringing in liquefied petroleum gas from Qatar and the United States, but that isn't going to be anywhere near as much to replace what they've lost.
And also, we have to understand a bit of Putin's strategy and all this, don't we, Robin? Because he's using clearly the gas as a kind of a political weapon against the EU and European leaders for backing the Ukraine over his invasion of Ukraine. But he can only hold out for so long. And what he's relying on is that Europe breaks and cracks. Because clearly this is also hurting the Russian economy, and Russia could go into a recession or depression if he can continue. So there's only a limited time that Putin can continue pursuing the policies he's doing by cutting the supply of gas to Europe without facing the devastating economic consequences in his own backyard.
Yeah, of course. And the longer this conflict drags on, the more difficult it's going to become for the Russian people, just because of the ripple effects of the sanctions that have been imposed on the Russian economy. I mean, yeah, Russians' revenue from gas and oil must have, pardon the expression, gone down the toilet, because so much, so the sanctions have put so many restrictions. Of course, I would suspect that Putin is probably looking for other markets, hence him reaching out to people like, the Chinese and others who are desperate for what he has to offer, as far as gas and oil are concerned. So maybe in the immediate term, it will have a crippling effect, but if it goes on and he finds other outlets, for his products, then it may actually rebound on the EU, because the slack is going to be taken up by other nations who are willing to forget the fact of who he is and what Russia is and just buy into what he has to offer.
Absolutely.
If I can say, you're absolutely right, because Nord Stream 2 from Russia to Germany, that pipeline isn't opening, but they've just opened a third pipeline between Russia and China. So gas supplies to China have increased. China is buying more of the slack in the Russian gas market.
Oh, incredible. And down to about 5 minutes left of the programme. So, David, I have to ask you, how should Europe respond to this crisis? And is the answer then to just stop our over-reliance on fossil fuels and realising that how much we want green renewable energy, it comes at the cost of European or Western civilization?
Yeah, well, I mean, two things. Absolutely. We've got to abandon this whole net zero madness, because that's based on the idea that carbon dioxide is a harmful gas, and it's not. There are real environmental problems, but carbon dioxide is not one of them. So trying to close down a good energy source infrastructure for the basis of a false premise is madness. We need to keep on with our coal power stations, our gas power stations, nuclear power stations, and not try to change into wind and solar, which aren't providing the energy. And the second thing is we need to try to end the conflict. And it's very worrying that a lot of Western politicians, both in the UK, the EU and the USA, are talking about an endless war with Russia. And even now also on the other side of the world, talking up a conflict with China as well over Taiwan. They need to step down from their warmongering and try to get round the table and end the conflict and get back to normal relations.
And Robin, do you see this is where Israel could come in and start supplying natural gas to Europe as an alternative to Russia?
Yeah, I think it's a possibility, but the question is, does Israel have the infrastructure at the moment? As David had pointed out, you can't do it overnight. You can't even do it in a month or 2 months. I mean, Israel is putting in place infrastructure to process the gas that is coming in from the fields at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. But they've got their problems too, because Hezbollah and Lebanon are threatening open conflict with Israel over one of those gas fields, one of the biggest of the gas fields. So even there, it's not a clear-cut, easy process for Israel to replace what we are losing or have lost. And as I said, David has pointed out, it's going to take time.
And David, for our viewers watching, what recommendations or practical advice have you got for them? Knowing that this programme is recorded in August, is aired in August, December is probably about 4 months away, but an understanding of that we're all heading for a very, very tough winter with the reduction in energy supplies and with natural gas not being available as much as it was before. So practically, what do you think we should best prepare for the coming winter?
It's always good to prepare for the worst. So, I mean, I would say, you have a little bit of a supply of food, drinking water ready just in case, shops, supermarkets run out of food. There's no drinking water. Have one of these sort of energy supply units, that can keep you going for a few hours, if you like, and maybe a petrol or diesel generator. So you've got a backup source of electricity. That's good advice to get ready.
And also, I think we need to look after the vulnerable as well, don't we, Robin? Particularly as we know that the winter has been very tough, and it's been a tough couple of winters also with the pandemic as well. So, what is your advice to our viewers to try and keep warm with the rising cost of electricity and fuel prices?
We need to be aware of family and friends and neighbours who may have some health issues or just age-related issues, and I mean, it's going to be a struggle. I think we'd have to be realistic. It potentially could be a real struggle. But as some of us learned to do in some senses during the COVID crisis, learn to look out for others, which is going to be a battle, because we have become such a self-centered, me first, westernized society. This is one of the major themes of our society. So it is something where certainly believers in Jesus may have an opportunity to take a lead, local churches, local fellowships, whatever, take a lead on making sure that those who are the most vulnerable are looked after.
And David, for our viewers watching as well, it's very good to do a programme like this, because I think the trouble with our politics currently over the last kind of couple of decades is the fact it's so short-sighted that we don't really see a problem until we hit that problem. And knowing that come December, January, we'll be in the midst of this problem, which will be a massive crisis, not only for Britain, but also much worse in Europe. So how do we pray regarding this situation? Because, this could be Europe's biggest crisis they faced in decades.
Yeah, I think we just got to pray that God will give us the grace to come through the hard times, because I think if this does go the way it's looking like, it'll be something that most people have never had any experience of in living memory. I hope there's not going to be an economic crash or something, but there might be. So we need to toughen up ourselves in our spirit, get our spirits ready, but also pray that we have the strength to withstand some completely new situations.
David and Robin, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's Politics Today. I want to thank you for watching at home. Yes, this programme has a very strong prophetic element to it as we look at the potential gas crisis affecting Britain and Europe come the winter. So the best thing we can do is just to be practical and to get everything we need, extra food, extra blankets, and also to pray, because we could be facing a very, very tough winter. So thank you for watching this week's Politics Today.